increase fatigue. The simple thing to think about is the temperature of the room. The warmer the temperature, warmer temperatures will induce fatigue. The ideal temperature to sleep in, and this is actually, there's studies on everything, right? The ideal temperature to sleep in is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 20 Celsius. Warmer temperatures will make you drowsy, but they're not good for sustaining sleep. The ideal temperature to work in is the same. It's 68 degrees, or 20 Celsius. What if you're a haul truck driver operating a truck and the air conditioning's broken on the truck and it's a 90-degree day? What does that do to your fatigue level? So very simple things like that will influence the level of fatigue for the operator. So taking into consideration these three different things that feed into fatigue, that's then where we develop a fatigue risk management system, where we have different levels of defense that we then incorporate into the system. When we build them around the Caterpillar, we use the 5 essential questions. So you can see the first one is do you have a process to manage the zero? And that would fall under the fatigue risk management system itself, the overarching plan for the company that addresses fatigue and what you do when it does happen. Do you do any root cause analysis whenever there's an accident or even a near miss? A lot of companies will look at the accidents, but the near miss is just a hair away from being an accident. So near miss investigation. Some of the things we like to look at when we're doing accident analysis when it's related to fatigue is, of course, the first thing is what time of the day did the accident happen or the near miss? How many shifts into the cycle was the individual working when this incident happened? Was he on his first night shift or second night shift? What was he doing 24 hours prior to the incident? We typically, as a fatigue expert, we typically look at the prior 7 days of work going into an accident. What was he doing 78 hours or 72 hours prior to the accident? Another question to consider is how long had it been since the previous sleep episode? How monotonous is the job that he was doing? Was this his normal duties at the time? So those are things to consider when doing a root cause analysis that's related to fatigue. The next thing we look at as far as a level of defense is the cultural stigmas around fatigue at the site. Not all the people that work for you will think that fatigue should be a priority. In fact, I talk to many shift workers and they tell me, well, it's just kind of par for the course, so to speak. We're going to get tired at some point if you're working night shifts. That's just the way it is. And if that's just the way it is, then it's even more important that we look at a comprehensive plan to help mitigate fatigue. What areas of the organization are involved when it comes to managing through the stigmas at the agency? Is it a priority for everyone? Another thing to consider are employees getting sufficient quality and quantity of sleep. So by doing a fatigue risk assessment, how much sleep are they getting based upon the current schedule that's in place? And what's the quality of that sleep? So the biggest thing is, how do you measure that? Well, one of the things that you could do is you could have volunteers, and I've done this many times, participate in a sleep study. Now, I'm not talking about a sleep study where we have people wearing EEG and we're measuring brainwave activity in order to determine which stage of sleep they're in, but there are devices on the market that will assist in measuring sleep. So at Caterpillar, we use the Caterpillar Smart Band. So it's a wrist-worn device that measures sleep. It's got an accelerometer in it. It's purely just measuring the quality and quantity of sleep. We're not looking at anything else, like how many steps the person had taken. what their heart rate is, what their blood pressure. We're looking purely at activity and the quality of sleep. The Caterpillar SmartBand is as 93% accurate as doing a polysomnography study, which is the gold standard on doing a sleep study. You can't have people working at your site driving trucks wearing EEG. That would not be, we would be then creating an unsafe environment instead of a safe environment. But what we can do is we can have them participate in a sleep study wearing these bands. Typically when I go into a mine site, I usually look for about 25 people to volunteer to wear it. And the last site I went into, I had 50 volunteers, so there was a lot of participation in it. I nearly always get at least 25 people, and I think some of that can be attributed to the fact that, first off, if you work shift work, you're interested in the quality and quantity of your sleep. As a shift worker, you should be. I have had shift workers that will tell me, you know, I'll have plenty of time to sleep when I'm dead, right? Well, the research shows the less sleep you get there quicker also. So it's also important to make sure that, again, we do make sleep a priority. So you can do a fatigue risk assessment. You can find out how much sleep are the individuals getting on average. You can also, after you've done your study, you can then look for a broader distribution of bands when you've had some individuals participate in it. It's easier to take like baby steps first to get people involved rather than trying to get the whole workforce to do it. So I would ask then, have you measured fatigue? The next thing to consider when you're building a fatigue risk management plan is, do employees have sufficient opportunity to get sleep? A lot of that will be built around the actual schedule itself and the breaks that are within the schedule. Do you do a staffing level analysis? Have you done one? Have you looked at breaking down the amount of overtime and then analyzing how many people I actually have in place? I've gone into work areas where a leadership person might tell me, we have way too much overtime, right? So we'll do a staffing level analysis, and what we find out is that it's not that you don't have enough people, it's the distribution of the overtime that's bad. So you have outliers that are working a lot of hours. Most environments that I go into, there's a 20-80 rule when it comes to overtime. And it's 20% of your people work 80% of the overtime is basically what we see. So the distribution of the overtime is also important. The amount of hours will influence the fatigue levels, obviously, that are involved within the site. So overtime is also another issue to consider. So you have the break schedules as well to think about when the breaks are set on the actual work activities for the individuals. A lot of companies that we're working with now are getting very aggressive about building napping policies into the work. I've worked with companies to build a napping room within the facility. Some agencies, this sounds kind of strange that you would have somewhere that somebody can take a nap. Now, how long is a nap? A nap is 10 to 15 minutes. It's not an hour and a half, right? So a power nap. We're very busy people. We have power naps and power lunches, right? We have to do everything in a hurry. So we're seeing a lot more of the acceptance of things like napping areas within the company. Or I was once working with a company that we were building a napping policy and building a napping area, and one of the employees said to me, Sal, there's been a napping policy at this agency for the last 10 years. Management didn't know about it, so people were napping anyway. The last thing to consider then, as far as building your fatigue risk management system, is do you have effective controls to mitigate the risk of those employees who are most exposed? So again, I asked you to think about what I said earlier. If fatigue is just par for the course, if fatigue is just part of working shift work, then it's even more important, if that is the case, that we have ways to mitigate fatigue while on site, especially in those jobs where there's high exposure for accidents. So obviously at Caterpillar, we look at haul truck drivers, right? They're operating very large, very expensive pieces of equipment. Within Caterpillar, we have what's called the driver safety system, and I'll share some information on that as well. The driver safety system is a piece of technology that will detect a microsleep. If a driver has a microsleep while operating the truck, it will wake that individual up. There will be an alarm that goes off in the truck, a vibration motor that's attached to the seat, and an audio alarm in the truck that will wake up the individual. I mentioned earlier about schedules, the work schedule. And I often have people ask me, okay, so Sal, you spent a lot of time looking at different work patterns. There's literally thousands of different schedules out there for people to work. What's the perfect schedule called? Or what does it look like? And to me, the perfect schedule is called retirement, where you stay home and you don't work and somebody sends you a check. But if you are going to go to work, then there's three things to consider, of course, when it comes to building a schedule. The first thing to look at are, what are the operational needs? What are the business needs of the operation? One of the first things that an operation might have is, it might be, I need 24/7. I need 168 hours of production, might be a request. That could be a business need. Another need might be the number of crews that you have to man the schedule. Whether I'm using a 3-crew schedule or a 4-crew schedule or a 5-crew type schedule. Many of the mine sites that I've worked with in Peru, they use 4-crew schedules, 4 teams, to man 168 hours of production. And if you do that, then if you take 168 hours, which is 24, there's 7 days in a week, 24 hours in a day, 7 times 24 is 168. So there's 168 hours of production. And if you divide that by 4 crews, then each crew would average a 42-hour work week, which is typical. Some places that we work with in England, I see them using more 5-crew schedules, where now they're averaging a 33.5 work week, which is actually, it was very common for a while to do that. And they would then roster vacation time into the schedule to bring it up to 40. In the US, they use typically 4-crew schedules in 90-something% of the environments. In the nuclear environments, they tend to use more, they'll use maybe a 5-crew or a 6-crew schedule, or chemical plants tend to use 5-crew schedules as well. Well, they'll roster in a week of training. Or they'll have a relief week built into the schedule where 1 crew's off and they're doing the relief coverage if somebody calls out for absenteeism. So then that's another business need to consider, is how do you want to cover the absenteeism? The scheduled absenteeism is usually easier to cover. So you know how much vacation time that your people have. You can build a schedule around the hours of vacation that are rostered into the schedule. The unscheduled absenteeism is harder to manage, when somebody takes time off without knowing. So there's operational needs to consider when building a schedule. There's also sociological needs, cultural preferences. I would recommend, if you ever consider changing your schedule, that you survey the people that work for you to get some ideas about the cultural needs of that group. And what you have at one site necessarily will not be the right schedule for a site that's maybe even 40, 80 kilometers away. We'll see cultural differences within areas that seem pretty close together too. So also requesting information or surveying for information from the people who actually work the schedule is recommended too. The last piece that I would ask you to consider when you're looking at designing an optimal schedule are, what are the biological constraints, the physiological things, to make sure that you're meeting health and safety requirements as well. The items that I talked about earlier. So when it comes to managing fatigue, one of the other pieces that's interesting, and I started learning about this many years ago, was that we have a biological clock, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's called the SCN for short. And your biological clock is located in the hypothalamus. It's located right above the optic nerves, where the optic nerves meet in the hypothalamus. And this biological clock controls hundreds and hundreds of circadian rhythms. The word circadian means about a day. So these are rhythms that last approximately a day long. It's a very powerful little nucleus of energy that's located in the brain that controls hundreds of these rhythms. What are examples of these circadian rhythms? Well, we have cortisol cycles that are influenced by your biological clock. They help us deal with stress. It's a daily rhythm. We have melatonin cycles. Melatonin is a sleep-inducing hormone that's influenced by our biological clock. We have growth hormones that are controlled as well. We also have our core body temperature. Our core body temperature fluctuates throughout a 24-hour day. It doesn't stay constant. It actually changes. Typically, when our core body temperature is at its lowest point, our alertness level is also at its lowest point. So we have hundreds of these circadian rhythms that are all controlled on a daily basis by our biological clock. Even when you eat is controlled by our biological clock. When we sleep. We often hear people talking about jet lag when they hop in an airplane and they fly through multiple time zones and they're then adjusting to the new change in time. They suffer from jet lag because of the time change. I live in Boston, so I'm on Eastern time. I came here to Central. It really didn't bother me that much. But if you go through multiple time zones, then your body starts to then struggle with adjusting to that new time. Shift workers will also suffer from jet lag. Well, it's not jet lag, it's called industrial lag, right? Their schedules are changing. Their body clock has to adjust to sleeping at different times. So think about if you're working a 12-hour schedule, and one week you're working day shift and you're sleeping nocturnal hours, and then the next week you're now trying to sleep during the day. What does that do as far as impacting our suprachiasmatic nucleus, or our biological clock? So again, what happens is our circadian rhythms then become out of sync, and we need time to adjust. Another circadian rhythm to consider is our alertness curve. Over a 24-hour period, this is what our alertness would look like. The average person follows a curve very similar to this. It might be shifted to the left or to the right, depending on whether or not we're an early morning lark or an extreme night owl. If you're a night owl, it'll shift the curve to the right. So we'll have a dip in alertness in the afternoon. Along the x-axis is the time of day. On the y-axis is how alert are we. This is a great study. They actually hired people to fall asleep. I should have signed up for it. I like sleeping, right? And they timed how long it would take for someone to fall asleep at different times of the day. And this was done with hundreds of people. So this is actually it's called a multiple sleep latency test. So within this scale, we can see there's a dip in alertness in the afternoon, and then we have a dip in alertness in the wee hours of the morning. And when you start looking